Hey there, my name's Pastor Blake Moore. Thanks so much for checking out one of our latest messages online. And we know that you will be blessed, encouraged and inspired as you watch this message today. Thanks for checking out one of our resources, and we would love to meet you in person very soon. God bless. Good morning. I was startled recently when I discovered that I really love watching revenge movies. Quite disturbing, really, when you think about it. But when you do think about it, you discover that a whole heap of the movies that are made in Hollywood, the revenge theme appears widely in the films. If you even look at the greatest movies of all time list, you will find that many of the movies have a revenge theme in them. I was actually also discovered that there's a list of the top most popular revenge movies list, and number 4 was The Lion King. Incredible. Just go away and think about that. But but when you think about these revenge movies, most of the revenge movies have their plot divided into a couple of parts. One part tells the reason why the character was forced to take revenge, while the other part focuses on the method that the revenge is executed. Usually it's the hero hunting down the bad guys, like Braveheart and Gladiator. I will have my vengeance in this life or the next. Or Law-Abiding Citizen, if anyone's seen that movie. But my favourite is Liam Neeson in Taken. Has anyone else seen this movie apart from me? A few people have seen it. Yeah. I don't know who you are. I don't know what you want. If you're looking for ransom, I can tell you that I don't have money. But what I do have are a very particular set of skills. Skills I have acquired over a very long career. Skills that make me a nightmare for people like you. If you let my daughter go now, that'll be the end of it. I will not look for you. I will not pursue you. But if you don't, I will look for you. I will find you. And I will kill you. Yeah. Maybe if this ministry thing doesn't work out, maybe not. Stick to my day job, yeah? Over the past few weeks in our series on the Sermon on the Mount called Upside Down, we have been entering deep waters, have we not? We've been entering deep waters, discovering how Jesus reinterprets old aspects of Old Testament law in the Sermon on the Mount. We've looked at murder and anger. Last week, I talked about adultery and divorce. If you missed that one, you can go and rewatch that on YouTube if you like. And today, I'm going to talk about revenge. Jesus actually said in the Sermon on the Mount that to enter heaven, you must have a righteousness that exceeds the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. So let us continue in Matthew chapter 5. Next Sunday, Steve's going to, I think, jump into the next chapter. But Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 42, Jesus is speaking here in his sermon. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. What did justice look like in the Old Testament? What did justice look like in the Old Testament? Jesus says, you have heard that it was said. The context is obviously concerning what they practiced under the Old Testament law. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Jesus is actually referring to the lex talionis, or the law of retribution, or also called the law of the tooth. It is mentioned actually, the law of the tooth, the law of retaliation, actually only 3 times in the Old Testament. And it sounds quite gruesome for us to take somebody's eye in personal revenge. But in fact, that was not the original intent of the law. The original intent was to limit, actually, excessive punishment. In fact, excessive punishment was actually prohibited. The purpose of this law was not to give you permission to take revenge on people who hurt you, but rather to limit the punishment that could be dealt out. It was not permissive, in fact, the law of the tooth, but indeed it was restrictive. And in so doing so, the law accomplished two things, actually, when it came to justice. And the first thing that this law of the tooth accomplished was the punishment fit the crime. The idea here is not just eye for an eye, but only an eye for an eye. Only a tooth for a tooth. You couldn't go beyond that. No excessive punishments allowed. No unlimited revenge. No sort of, you knocked out my tooth, so I'm going to knock off your head. This law actually promoted justice, the law of the tooth, rather than revenge. Revenge could care less whether the punishment fits the crime, right? Revenge just wants to hurt the other person. Revenge just wants to get the other person back. And so you had people like a guy called Lamech in Genesis chapter 4:23, who actually, if you read that, he boasted, I have killed a man for wounding me. I've killed a young man for injuring me. So the law of the tooth was meant to prevent excessive punishment. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. The punishment fit the crime. The second thing that this law achieved was that evil was actually restrained. You might not care what happened to someone else, but if you are actually liable for the same charges and the same damages yourself, you would most likely refrain. So it restrained people from evil actions. And at the same time, it also restrained people from the evil of actually making false accusations. And in fact, in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verses 16 to 21, we see these words in the law. If a malicious witness takes the stand to accuse a man of a crime, the judges must make a thorough investigation. And if the witness proves to be a liar, then do to him as he intended to do to his brother. The rest of the people will hear of this and be afraid, and never again will such an evil thing be done among you. The law of Moses. So the original intent of this law was that excessive punishment is actually prohibited. The punishment fits the crime and evil was restrained. Like pretty much in other words, this was a good law with good outcomes and results. Also, this law talked about that personal revenge is actually forbidden. Did you notice that the law of the tooth, which I read there before, is actually took place within the court systems, with judges in place and with careful investigations? The law applied, this law of the tooth, you might not realise this, but only applied to courts, not to matters of personal revenge. You were supposed to, under the law, let the courts do their job. The problem was that the Pharisees had extended this teaching to include personal relationships. And so instead of a principle limiting excessive punishment by the courts, they made it into personal permission for exacting the maximum amount of revenge allowed under the law. Basically, the Pharisees, they totally misinterpreted the law to give themselves permission to retaliate. But really, when you look at God's word, it's always been clear that personal revenge has been forbidden. God says in Deuteronomy chapter 32-35, it is mine to avenge. It is mine to avenge, I will repay. And then Paul quotes that and adds on that in Romans chapter 12-19. Do not take revenge, my friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. So the context of this Old Testament command of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, that excessive punishment was prohibited and personal revenge in relationships was forbidden. And I know the human side of people, particularly because I'm a human, but the human side of people often struggle with understanding this, and probably even Christians, but unbelievers as well, who say, how can God allow this evil to happen, right? How can God allow that murderer to get off so lightly? Or the murders that have gone unsolved in society? And perpetrators that are still not caught? Child abusers and people who commit heinous crimes and seem to get away with it. It may look like these people have gotten away with hideous crimes. It may look like a dictator like Putin seems to just like live forever and get away with everything, right? It may look like that people have gotten away with hideous crimes, but let me tell you something. God's wrath, is simply compounding. God's wrath is simply compounding. God says, you need to Paul says, let there be room, leave room for God's wrath. It may seem like they're getting away with it, but no, God's wrath is simply compounding. And then Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, so he unpacks this understanding of the law of the tooth, the law of retaliation. And Jesus comes, and the upside down element to this, folks, is that Jesus preached radical love over revenge. This is the upside down piece here. For the original listeners on that mountaintop, radical love over revenge. Jesus gives his deeper meaning beyond the law, just as he did with murder and just as he did with adultery and divorce. The Old Testament taught justice was good. Jesus taught radical love over revenge, which is even better. Jesus says, but I tell you. Remember last week when Jesus says, but I tell you? When Jesus says, but I tell you, this is Jesus' authoritative word on the matter. This is Jesus' authoritative word on the subject. Jesus said, do not resist an evil person. And so Jesus moves us from the realm of limited retaliation under the law to no retaliation. Yes, the Pharisees said you could take an eye for an eye. But Jesus says, I tell you, do not resist an evil person. Please notice that these words of Jesus were spoken to individuals in their personal relationships. I need to make this point clear to you. Spoken to individuals in their personal relationships. This is important because some people over the decades, over many, many years, hundreds of years, have misinterpreted these words to say that we should not resist any evil at all. In fact, Leo Tolstoy famously used these words of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount to argue that we should get rid of the military, we should get rid of the courts, and we should get rid of the police force altogether, that we should just let evil play itself out on its own and leave it all at the end of the day in God's hands. But that is not what Jesus taught. And that is definitely not what Jesus is saying here. Jesus is talking to individuals in their personal relationships with others. Jesus is basically saying, hey, there should be no Christian vigilantes. No Christian revenge. No taking the law into your own hands. No trying to get even with others. Jesus said, when someone hurts you, when someone upsets you, when someone offends you, instead of taking revenge, Jesus says, love them back. Love them back. Denny and Layla Abdallah lost their children, Anthony, Angelina, Sienna, along with their niece, when they were hit by a car while walking along a footpath to get ice cream. The driver, Samuel Davidson, is serving a 20-year jail sentence for the incident that took place in Oatlands in Western Sydney on February 1st, 2020. Samuel Davidson, he was under the influence of drugs and alcohol at the time. You may remember this. The incident shocked the whole of Australia. The thing about this is, having already forgiven the driver and the Abdullahs founding the I Forgive Foundation to remember their lost loved ones and encourage others to find forgiveness. Dad Denny took it to a whole one step further. He went to actually meet the driver, and he had an organised visit in jail. And Danny revealed at first he didn't know how things would go. I shook his hand, and he just fell to his knees and put his head on the floor and said, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry I took your kids," he told the Sunday Telegraph. He was crying, and I was crying, and you just see nobody won in this. And Danny goes on and said, "I was at a crossroads in my life, and the hardest question as a parent is, you can lose your whole family with bitterness and seek revenge, or you can keep half of your family and find forgiveness." Former Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who's become close friends with the family following the incident, hailed the family's composure, and he said they had every right to be furious. They had every right to be vindictive. They had every right to lash out, and they chose a different path. And I know why they did, because they share the same faith, he said. It's an incredible story, right? That family understands this teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. That family gets it. Let me just briefly talk to you about governments, courts, military, and the police. There is a different set of scriptural commands for governments, courts, the military, and the police. For example, we read in Romans 13, "Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority?" Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he, the government, is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. That's what Paul's teaching in Romans chapter 13. In other words, it's the government's job to resist evil in society. The courts should punish lawbreakers, the military should protect our country, and the police should arrest criminals. Do not resist an evil person is a command for individuals, not for the government. Are you with me? There is also nothing wrong with the Christian using the court system to resist evil and to promote justice, as long as you're not doing it out of personal revenge. That even as we practice Jesus' radical love, we need to make sure that we do not encourage or enable sin in others. And so you may, and this is what Danny Abdallah has done and practiced. He understands this. And so you may personally forgive someone, as he did, and yet still prosecute them. And he has a civil case against the perpetrator. So you can forgive someone and yet still prosecute. Not out of hate for the person, not out of revenge, but out of love for society. I want you to listen to this. In fact, love for your neighbour. You want to love your neighbour? Love for your neighbour requires prosecution of a criminal. I'll say that again. Love for your neighbour and love for society requires prosecution of a criminal. A Christian may prosecute a criminal out of love to public justice. Do you understand what I'm saying here? Though not from private revenge. So justice is given over to the courts. But Jesus commands you as a Christian to practice radical love over revenge. So let me just finish this message off today by talking about 4 examples of radical love over revenge that Jesus talks about. Let's look at these examples. Jesus starts, firstly, with personal insults. Personal insults. Has anyone been personally insulted here? Yeah? Yep. Personal insults, turn the other cheek. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Jesus is speaking here of the backhanded slap across the right cheek. The backhanded slap was deemed a great insult in Jesus' day and was even punishable by law, a backhanded slap. It carried twice the fine of an open-handed slap under the law. The thing about this is that most people, I know there's some left-handed people in the room, but most people are right-handed, right? So if you're right-handed, it's really hard to do that. And so right-handed is a backhanded slap on the right cheek. That's the most natural thing, not that. That. Jesus said if someone slaps you across the right cheek, then turn to him the other as well, so he can do that, the left. Now, once again, the context of this verse is radical love over revenge. This verse does not prohibit self-defense or protecting others from harm. Jesus does not say if someone gouges out your right eye, allow them to gouge out your left. Jesus doesn't say if someone is bullying someone that you should allow the bully to keep on bullying. No, as a Christian, we may fight to protect ourselves and others from physical harm, and we're to stand up for the oppressed. But what we must not do is strike back in anger or strike back in revenge. And so Jesus says, turn the other cheek. The left. Yeah, see? Left. Then Jesus goes on about lawsuits. Let them have your cloak as well. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. Jesus moves from unjust actions against you, against your person and your personhood, insults, to unjust actions against your possessions. The tunic, in Jesus' example, was a person's undergarment, while the cloak was the outer garment, or we'd know it as a coat. Now, by law, you could take someone's tunic, but you could not take someone's outer garment, because they may have had to use it to sleep as a blanket. In other words, although you didn't have a right to your tunic, you did have a right to your cloak. So Jesus is saying we should be willing to sacrifice even our own rights in order to reach out to other people. How are you going with this? Now, again, you've got to balance this command with other scriptures that you have a scriptural obligation to care for your family and to protect your property and estate. So if someone is suing you, suing your business, suing your livelihood, and your livelihood is at stake, and your family is at stake, you should use the courts to defend yourself. But even then, you do it out of responsibility to your livelihood and to your loved ones and family, not out of personal animosity to the person who's suing you. Oh, gee. Oh. Deeper water. And when you do that, you still look for ways to reach out to the person who is causing the offence. Jesus says, no, respond with radical love that is even willing to give up your rights rather than take revenge on the person who is suing you. And then he moves on to the third example, forced actions. Forced actions, go the second mile. Jesus' third example has to do with these forced actions. In verse 41, if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. The Jews in Jesus' day, as you know, were under Roman occupation. And the Roman soldiers could stop you as a citizen, as a Jew, at any time and force you to carry their belongings, but only for prescribed distance. So now you get an understanding behind Simon of Cyrene, don't you? So you understand why the Roman soldiers stopped Simon of Cyrene to carry Jesus across. Now listen, it was bad enough to be forced to do something you didn't want to do. But this was the ultimate offence, carrying equipment for the enemy who occupied your land. The Roman mile was about 1,000 paces, or about 4,800 feet, just shy of a modern day mile. Jesus says, if someone forces you to go 1 mile, instead of fussing and complaining and fighting about it, why don't you just double the distance? Show a radical love that goes beyond what is required. In a sense, Jesus is saying, you know what? They forced you to go 1 mile. So they owe you a mile. They owe you a mile. So why don't you pay it off for them? Why don't you pay off the mile that they owe you? By walking the extra mile. Go the extra mile so the debt is paid in full, and show them radical love over revenge. And then finally, Jesus talks about requests. Give to the one who asks you. Personal insults, lawsuits, forced actions, requests. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Proverbs 3, verse 27 says, do not withhold good from those who deserve it when it is in your power to act. Sure. But what if they don't deserve it? What if they don't deserve it? What if they've hurt you in the past? Does that let you off the hook? They've hurt me, so why do I have to answer their requests? They've hurt me. Go away. I want nothing to do with you. I got a long list of insults and hurts from this person. They can go to somebody else. Does that let you off the hook? Does Jesus let us off the hook? No, he doesn't. He doesn't let us off the hook even then. It doesn't matter what they've done. Their asking you should not be an opportunity for refusal and to get even, but rather an opportunity for radical love over revenge. I got to tell you now, that's challenging. That's challenging. When someone insults you, when someone says lies about you, when someone defames you, once again, I say that, and we need to balance with other scriptures. Jesus is not saying, if someone asks for your house, you should give them your house. Let's be honest here. He's not saying that. I mean, you've got to understand, 2 Thessalonians 3:10 says, if a man will not work, he shall not eat. It doesn't say if a man can't work, he shouldn't eat. But Jesus says, if a man or woman will not work, they shouldn't eat. You should apply that today in 2025. Good luck. And so we're not to encourage laziness by giving someone something they should be working for. Okay, so there's the counterpoint to it. But Jesus' point in all 4 of these examples is that as Christians we should never try to get even or get back at another person. There is no place for grudges in the Christian church. I mean, there are Christians who have grudges against other Christians. I mean, that's not Jesus. Get rid of it. Rather, we should practice radical love over revenge. We should practice mercy rather than justice. We should go beyond what is required and trust God with the results. And people get hurt, right? Hurt people always hurt people. Do you know that? Some of you know that well. Hurt people will always hurt others. Hurt people hurt people. People get hurt in relationships. People get hurt in workplaces and churches. People get hurt in families. And Jesus says, don't react. Like in relationships, how often do we react instead of responding? In marriages, how often do we react instead of responding? Don't react, but respond. And Jesus said, respond with radical love over revenge. I mean, this stuff is impossible in your own strength. It is impossible to do this in your own. You can't. So I said the last 2 weeks, you've got to run to the foot of the cross of Christ and seek mercy. And yet, I think of my Lord and Saviour Jesus. My goodness, we're about to celebrate this. We're about to reflect on it in a few weeks. 1 Peter 2. I mean, there's no better example of Jesus Christ himself, particularly as we approach Easter. 1 Peter 2:23. Imagine this. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly.